geishas committing suicide.
I beg your pardon.
An all-powerful emperor enforcing cruel punishments. While W.S. Gilbert's opera satirized Imperial Britain during the reign of Queen Victoria, these images from the Mikado and Madame Butterfly express continuing Australian attitudes towards Japan. In addition, if we attend carefully to those stage works, we can perceive other players. Captain Pinkerton is an operatic version of the US Navy, forcing its way into Japan in the 1850s. However, Australia's relations with Japan make sense only when the competing white empires of Britain and the United States of America are included. Those three empires went to war late in 1941. Japan's navy raided the US fleet in Pearl Harbor. 2 months later, its Imperial Army captured the British base at Singapore. Japan had attacked the Anglo-Saxon empires in order to seize the Dutch-controlled Sumatran oil fields and the British Malayan rubber plantations. Japan lacks most natural resources essential for modern industrial development, and those shortages encouraged its wartime expansionism. Australians had relied on British power to protect us, but when the time came, we found we had to depend on the United States instead. After retreating from the Philippines, the American General Douglas MacArthur used Australia as an unsinkable aircraft carrier from which to launch a counter-offensive in the Pacific. At the end of the Pacific War, US personnel made up most of the forces occupying Japan between 1945 and 1952. An Australian general headed the British Commonwealth contingent, and Australian troops were sent to Hiroshima, an area too sensitive for the US military. Australia's contribution to the war effort, as well as its obvious Pacific interests, increased Canberra's say vis-à-vis London's. Australian diplomat Patrick Shaw was chosen to take the British Commonwealth seat on the Allied Council, alongside US, Soviet, and Chinese representatives. But the entire British Commonwealth of Nations could not match US global power. An Australian High Court judge and former Chief Justice of Queensland, Sir William Webb, presided over the war crimes trials in Tokyo. Webb unsuccessfully opposed the hanging of wartime Prime Minister Tojo because the US refused to try the emperor. Hirohito was retained as a puppet leader, but supreme power resided with the shadow shogun, General Douglas MacArthur. At the war's end, most of the peoples who had been enslaved by the Japanese militarists were reconquered by their old European controllers. Under Field Marshal Slim of the Burma campaign, British forces and firms returned to Burma, Malaya, Borneo, and Singapore. In addition, British troops helped the Dutch to retake Indonesia. Yet, business could not be as usual for the British. Throughout Asia, British power was soon in retreat before independence movements and communist revolutions, as well as American interests. Military successes by Japan had doomed direct European colonization in Asia. Between 1945 and 1959, the US gave up formal control of the Philippines. Britain granted political independence to India, Burma, Malaysia, and Singapore. Communist revolutions triumphed in China, Korea, and Vietnam. Non-aligned nations, such as Burma, India, and Indonesia, softened the US alliance system. Cold War Asia was one more byproduct of Japanese militarism. Although Japan's military advances had been soundly defeated by 1945, The experience confirmed traditional Australian fears of Asia. The communist revolutions now spreading through Asia further fueled those fears. Most Australians hoped to move closer to both Britain and to the USA, but three obstacles stood in our way. To begin with, the prime concerns of both those world powers remained in Europe or the Middle East. Then, in our own Asia-Pacific region, British and US interests competed against each other. And finally, neither British nor US perceptions of the region coincided with ours. A major dispute erupted over how to treat post-war Japan, as an enemy or an ally. US strategists wanted Japan to take China's place on the front line against the Soviet Union in Asia. American policy required a strong Japan and a soft peace. It hoped to achieve this by rearming Japan, which in turn meant reviving Japan's industrial bases. In one sense, that would also benefit Australia, as Japan's economic growth would require more trade with countries such as ours. But that switch would be at the expense of British exporters, with whom we had a long history. US aims for an Asian military alliance anchored to Japan met fierce opposition from many quarters. Most Japanese themselves did not want to be involved with military adventures.
On the eve of Ike's planned visits, riots and outbreaks have been ominously frequent. Finally, Speaker Kiyoshi calls the House to order, and the treaty is voted on. The socialists abstain, but the huge pro-government, pro-American majority makes the result a foregone conclusion.
Nations such as Australia remained suspicious of Japan. In 1952, Prime Minister Menzies declared that the instinctive reaction of Australia to any proposal for a Japanese peace settlement is keep them down. Don't let them rearm. Don't trust them. So, instead of a grand alliance, the USA had to be content with a patchwork of zonal treaties, one with Japan and another with Australia and New Zealand, known as ANZUS.
It was initially designed as a way of dealing with the rise of communism through Asia, but also as a way of dealing with the domestic resentment towards Japan within Australia. The Liberal Prime Minister Menzies in the early 1950s made it very clear to the Americans that if he signed a peace treaty with Japan at the American insistence, but didn't also get a protective alliance with the United States at the same time, he would be voted out of office. That he couldn't possibly survive as Prime Minister of Australia if he signed a peace treaty with the evil Japanese and didn't get some guarantee. Now, that was the public story. Beneath that, there was a much more complex and interesting story as to what they really needed. The Australian government had, somewhat reluctantly, agreed to send forces to the Middle East. In 1950, they'd made this agreement. To protect the trade route through the Suez Canal, to protect the oil resources for the Western Alliance. So ANZUS was designed to let Australia go off and support the Western Alliance in the Middle East and in Europe, while keeping the Japanese threat, this imagined threat, but also the possible threat of Indonesia going communist or India going communist, which was one of the great fears in the early 1950s. It all followed China down this route. Now, as that was happening, as all this was being put in place, something else happened, which no one had anticipated. That is, the Korean War broke out. The whole thing is a complete disaster in organisational terms. There's not enough people, not enough equipment to do all of these demands that are now being placed upon the government. So that the ANZUS alliance becomes even more urgent as a piece of paper for the government to be able to wave and say, look, yes, the things are a mess, we can't do it properly, but we have this guarantee from the Americans that they will come and save us no matter what. But what they were really offering was not to send land forces to Australia to protect us again. It wasn't going to be like 1942. What they were really offering was something quite different. They were offering naval security. they were offering to keep the sea lanes under control. They were saying, look, we can control, with your help, regional pacts, we can control the sea lanes around you. And then if some little problem breaks out, you can then concentrate all your forces on that one particular place, being sure that you're not going to be attacked from two other directions at the same time. And I think if you look over the last 40 years, one might make judgments as to whether it was a good thing or not, but that support, that provision of a strategic defence of a maritime kind, the Americans have really kept their part of the bargain.
The need for diplomatic contacts in the 1950s combined both commercial and security imperatives. Finally, following the web of US-contrived treaties, Australia and Japan exchanged ambassadors in 1953.
You can see in the latter half of the 50s a gradual shift in the Australian position. It voted for Japan's membership of the United Nations. It concluded the very important trade treaty with Japan, which allowed Japanese manufactured goods equal access into Australia, equal with, in other words, MFN, most favoured nation treatment. And when we move into the 60s, of course, the minerals boom is just starting to take off. From then on, Australia quite rapidly moved to a position of general support for Japan. Today, of course, it's become 100% support on any issue, territorial, United Nations, sending troops abroad, because of our enormous economic dependence, because of the almost the cargo cult attitude that we have towards Japan, that Japan is somehow or other going to bring the goodies which will rescue the Australian economy.
The developing relationship between Japan and Australia can also be illustrated at a more grassroots level of contact between the two peoples. Unlike most other Asian countries, almost no Japanese have migrated to Australia as permanent settlers. And even tourism between Australia and Japan was a one-way street before the 1980s.
Australia's overseas airline blazes yet another sky trail as the inaugural flight of the Qantas Super Constellation Sydney to Tokyo service departs from Mascot.
Direct 24-hour flights between Sydney and Tokyo via Manila began in 1955, and Japan was a cheap destination for Australians. Until 1975, $1 Australian would buy 400 yen. Since the mid-1980s, the flow has been reversed. At 100 yen to the dollar, Australia is now cheap for Japanese. More than 500,000 came in 1991, many on guided tours.
It's often said that tourism would promote mutual understanding, but is that the case, I wonder? I mean, lots of countries in Southeast Asia now say that it may not be the case. It's partly because language differences as well as practical differences, like Japanese tend to extend their sort of concept of group tours to the sort of maximum, that they travel in Japanese airlines and arrives in stay at Japanese hotels, and they don't mix with the local people. And that is happening in Australia as well, far north in Queensland, like the Surfers Paradise, Gold Coast. That point is mentioned. So Japanese have to do their own, lift their own game, as well as Australians.
Despite their post-war fears, in 1957, Australia signed a trade treaty to remove discrimination against Japanese imports. At the same time, Australia's trade with Britain began to decline as both countries diversified. In the new scheme, however, no one nation has replaced Britain as the supplier of half of our imports. Japan and the United States presently each supplied 20%. But Japan has taken over from Britain by purchasing 25% of our exports.
One of the characteristics of Australian economic development has been that it's always tended to occur, in a sense, in the shadow of another stronger economy. And in the 19th and early 20th century, of course, that was Britain. And Australia's economic development, in a sense, was tied to what was happening in Bradford and Huddersfield and so on, the growth of the textile industry leading to the growth of the wool industry here. In the 50s and 60s, as Britain's economic power declined, we had the good fortune of being able to shift to linking our economy with another rapidly growing economy, and that, of course, was Japan. So in that period, we were growing in the shadow, as it were, of Kawasaki and Nagoya. And that meant very different sort of economic growth, because the high growth in Japan in the 1950s and 60s was geared to what they call heavy and chemical industries, the steel industry and so on. So you see a big shift during that period in Australia's trade, away from Britain and towards Japan, away from traditional staples like wool and towards things like iron ore. Japan's growth, I suppose, was a great windfall for Australia. On the other hand, though, perhaps it made us a little complacent. It was too easy. We didn't have to think about restructuring our economy. It was, in a sense, done for us.
By 1950, we exported $24 million worth of goods to Japan and imported $7 million worth back. By 1990, we were exporting $12 billion worth of goods and importing $10 billion worth in return. Australians remain much happier selling to Japan than buying its products. Because Japan remained so poor for so long after the war, its corporations were slow to invest here. Although they were desperate for minerals, the Japanese bought very few mining shares. Instead, Japanese companies began investing in the new field of high technology production.
From the early 1970s, the main shift in Japan was away from the traditional heavy and chemical industries towards what they called knowledge-intensive industry, so the growth of the computer industry and robotics and so on, and also a shift away from manufacturing and towards leisure and services. Another big change that you get from the late 1960s is the rapid growth of Japanese overseas investment. That has made life very much harder for manufacturers within Australia, because it's meant that Southeast Asian countries with much lower labour costs are starting to develop a substantial industrial infrastructure, and we're having to compete with them. Another part of that story, of course, is that Japanese investment was also starting to come into Australia. A lot of the investment that was coming in was in mining, and it tended to be not Japanese companies buying up mines, but investing in buying a proportion of the shares in mining ventures. So it wasn't very visible, it wasn't a big issue.
Japanese money attracted attention in Australia in the late 1980s because it went into tourism and real estate. Despite the generally held notion that Japan was systematically buying the country it failed to gain militarily, a 1992 survey showed that Japanese owned less Queensland property than American, British, or even Argentinian investors. In industry, UK and US-owned firms each contributed 10% to the turnover of Australian manufacturing. By contrast, Japanese corporations held only 2%.
The problem is, of course, that Australia just doesn't have the market big enough to justify any major manufacturing investment. If Australia was prepared to protect its market for a period of time so they could get established, fine, but at the moment, if they put up a factory to produce televisions, well, the Taiwanese and the Koreans will sort of start dumping and factory investment will be lost. All of us are being sandbagged by the Asian productivity. And in this situation, we either sort of go under, mouthing platitudes about free trade and how this is going to save us, or we get down and do what they did when they were at a disadvantage. Japan, in the past, when it had problems in developing new industries, had no hesitation whatsoever in maximum protection, 100%, 200%, you name it. And it was on that basis that Japan got a car industry. On that basis, it got a computer industry. Well, now it's Australia's turn to take the same tough, hard-nosed attitude. If we can't get these industries through the mechanism of free trade, then we'll just have to go the infant industry route. Now, that's allowed for under the rules of free trade. It's allowed for under the rules of GATT. But I think somebody in Canberra doesn't like the idea that Australia, as a developed country, would be creating infant industries. We're supposed to already have a mature industrial base. We haven't. We're back in the kindergarten.
Automobiles are one area of undisputed Japanese dominance in Australian industry. The motor trade was one of the first areas where US corporations challenged the British in Australia. Even before the war, 75% of all new vehicles sold in Australia came from US firms. In 1951, 33% of all vehicles sold here were British, the main supplier by then being British Motor Corporation, which included Leyland. But in 1974, Leyland closed down, and by 1991, the annual Australian sales of British passenger vehicles had slumped to a mere 0.1% of the market. Between 1961 and 1967, the Japanese share of Australia's motor vehicle market rose from 0.1% to over 10%. Australians were beginning to prefer small Japanese cars to the once popular British Mini. Then came the turn of US manufacturers to feel the pressure. In 1979-1980, Chrysler sold out to its junior partner, Mitsubishi, and by March 1981, the managing director of Ford Australia said, "We're all Japanese now." Today, more than half of the cars sold in Australia come from Japanese makers. Neither the Australian people nor our governments set out to break away from Britain. We might have whinged like Poms, but we never rebelled like the Yanks had. Instead, Britain and Australia have moved apart because of activities by Japan and the United States. Japanese and American power cut across our defense links to Britain in 1941 and 1942. We slipped from Britain to the USA in military terms before economic ones. But from the 1960s, Britain refocused its trade towards Europe. When Britain finally entered the European common market, Australian bonds of sentiment for the old country withered further. Because Australians did not initiate these changes, many of our leaders responded by seeking a new mother country.
I hope there will be a corner of your mind and heart which takes cheer from the fact that you have an admiring friend, a staunch friend, that will be all the way with LBJ.
Every American and LBJ is with Australia all the way.
LBJ led Australia all the way back to the jungles of Southeast Asia. Vietnam was the first conflict in which Australians fought that did not involve Britain or her imperial interests. Since the American withdrawal from Vietnam, there has been talk of an Asian homeland, with the emphasis on Japan. One weakness in the turn towards Japan is our lack of experience in setting the terms for dealing with our two previous great and powerful friends.
I think what's going to happen is that we're going to maintain some sentiment towards Great Britain. We're not going to lose that. There's just too many links. Even when Britain is sort of absorbed into Europe in 10 or 20 years' time, there'll still be bits of things that are directly linking us back to the old British Isles, in all of their guises. The United States link is economically still going to remain very powerful, and a kind of cultural linkage there too, although people sort of, you know, resent that Hollywoodization or the Coca-Colaization of bits of their lives. We've just learned, beginning to learn, that the Japanese economy is not absolutely powerful throughout the world, that the weaknesses that the rest of us have, they share in as well. I mean, they're having their recessions too, and they are having to pay the price of the speculative boom of the 80s as well. So the notion that, you know, that Japan in some way could save us economically if only it invested here, or our fear of that happening, has declined a great deal. So that there'll be a kind of better balance between sentiment towards Britain, commercial attitude towards the United States, and this hesitant and somewhat nervous attitude towards Japan. The exciting thing, of course, about that Japan end for everybody is it going to be a military power? Certainly, I think Japan will probably get into the United Nations Security Council as a permanent member, but whether it has a veto, of course, will be another interesting debate that will go on, and what Australians will think of this. Because if Japan goes in, you ask yourself who might come out. I mean, should France come out? Should Great Britain? I mean, what right has a third-rate world power like Britain to have a permanent seat with a veto in the United Nations after 1996? So I think the conflicts are going to arise on those specific issues again when people say, yes, well, Japan should come in to the Security Council, but not at the expense of putting Great Britain out. So that this old tug between Britain on the one side and Japan on the other will be revived around specific issues like that.
Australia's clear task ahead is to manage those competing links with Britain, America and Japan to our advantage. The more distant our cultural connection with each power is, the harder we will have to work to have a determining role in that relationship.